Today I am bringing you 9 deeply unsettling tales from the Appalachian deep woods, where ancient mountains hide secrets that refuse to stay buried. In this episode, we will journey into the darkest hollows and most isolated ridges, where 9 individuals encountered something that defied explanation. Each story has been meticulously researched and adapted from first-hand accounts provided by those who survived to share their experiences. These are not mere campfire tales, but documented encounters that left lasting marks on those who lived through them. To protect the identities of those involved, certain names and specific locations have been changed. Jalen had always considered herself a rational person. As a wildlife photographer with 6 years of experience traversing the most remote corners of the Appalachian Mountains, she had encountered black bears, bobcats, and even a few aggressive wild boars. None of those encounters had ever shaken her the way 3 days in October 2023 would. What happened on Blackwater Ridge stripped away every logical explanation she had ever clung to, leaving behind only the raw, primal fear that something truly inexplicable stalked those ancient woods. The assignment seemed straightforward enough. A conservation magazine had hired Jalen to document the autumn migration patterns of various bird species through the Appalachian corridor. Blackwater Ridge, located in a particularly isolated section of the mountains straddling the border between Virginia and West Virginia, offered the perfect vantage point. The ridge sat at nearly 4,000 feet elevation, with dense old growth forest that had somehow escaped the logging operations of the previous century. Few people ventured that far into the wilderness, which meant minimal human interference with the wildlife she needed to photograph. Jalen had planned a 4-day solo expedition. She parked her truck at an abandoned logging road and hiked 8 miles into the forest, setting up her base camp in a small clearing near a spring-fed stream. The first day passed without incident. She captured stunning photographs of migrating warblers and thrushes, documented several species of woodpeckers, and even spotted a golden eagle soaring above the ridgeline. As the sun began to set, she prepared a simple meal on her camp stove and settled into her tent, exhausted but satisfied with the work accomplished. The first sign that something was wrong came around midnight. Jalen woke to absolute silence. Anyone who has spent time in the wilderness knows that forests are never truly quiet at night. There are always sounds, the rustling of small mammals, the distant calls of owls, the whisper of wind through leaves. But on that first night, the forest had gone completely still, as if every living creature was holding its breath. Jalen lay in her sleeping bag, listening to the oppressive silence, feeling her heart rate gradually increase. She told herself it was nothing, that perhaps a storm was approaching and the animals had taken shelter. But when she checked her weather app, the forecast showed clear skies for the next 72 hours. Then she heard the voice. It came from somewhere beyond her tent, distant but distinct. It was calling her name, not shouting but speaking conversationally, as if someone was looking for her in the darkness. The voice sounded like her older brother, Marcus. The same tone, the same slight southern drawl, the same inflection he used when he was trying to get her attention. But Marcus lived in Charlotte, over 200 miles away, and nobody knew her exact location except for the magazine editor who had assigned the project. Jalen grabbed her flashlight and unzipped the tent flap just enough to peer outside. The beam of her light cut through the darkness, illuminating the clearing around her campsite. Nothing moved. The voice called again, still using her brother's voice, but now it seemed to come from a different direction, somewhere off to her left, near the tree line. She remained frozen, every instinct screaming at her not to respond, not to leave the relative safety of her tent. After several minutes of silence, she finally convinced herself that exhaustion and the isolation were playing tricks on her mind. She sealed the tent and eventually drifted back into an uneasy sleep. The second day started normally enough. Morning sunlight filtered through the forest canopy. Birds resumed their calls, and the oppressive atmosphere of the previous night seemed like nothing more than a bad dream. Jalen spent the day hiking along the ridge, photographing wildlife and collecting data. She tried to push the memory of the voice from her mind, focusing instead on her work. But as the afternoon wore on, she began to notice something disturbing. She kept catching glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision. Nothing concrete, just fleeting shadows that disappeared the moment she turned to look directly at them. Around 4 in the afternoon, while reviewing photographs on her camera, Jalen noticed something in one of the images that made her blood run cold. The photo showed a cluster of mountain laurel bushes about 30 yards from where she'd been standing. In the shadows behind the bushes, barely visible, was the outline of what appeared to be a person. But the proportions were wrong. The figure was too tall, too thin, with limbs that seemed slightly too long for a normal human frame. The image was blurry enough that she could not make out any distinct features, but the longer she stared at it, the more certain she became that something had been watching her. She scrolled through the other photographs from that location, checking the timestamps. 5 images taken over the course of 3 minutes. In each photograph, the figure had moved closer, not walking but simply appearing nearer in each successive frame, as if it was teleporting forward whenever she was not looking directly at it. In the final image, taken just seconds before she had moved to a new location, the figure stood at the very edge of the laurel bushes, no more than 15 yards away from where she had been standing. Jalen felt her hands begin to tremble as she reviewed the images. She was an experienced outdoors woman, familiar with how shadows and light could create illusions in forest photography. But this was different. This was deliberate. Something had been stalking her, moving closer while remaining just out of her direct line of sight, and she had been completely unaware of its presence until reviewing the photographs hours later. That evening, Jalen made a decision that probably saved her life. She gathered extra firewood, far more than she would normally need for a single night, and built a large fire in the center of her clearing. She positioned her tent so that the entrance faced the fire, giving her a clear view of the flames and the illuminated area surrounding her campsite. Then she settled in to wait, her satellite phone charged and ready, though she knew that even if she called for help, it would take search and rescue teams at least 12 hours to reach her location. The voice returned at exactly midnight. She knew the time because she had been checking her watch obsessively every few minutes. This time, it did not use her brother's voice. Instead, it mimicked her mother, then her best friend from college, then a former boyfriend. Each voice was perfect, capturing every nuance and characteristic of the person it was imitating. The voices came from different directions, sometimes overlapping, creating an impossible conversation between people who were hundreds of miles apart. But worse than the voices was what Jalen could now see at the edge of the firelight. The figure stood just beyond the reach of the flames, barely visible in the darkness. It was humanoid in shape, but wrong in every proportion. Too tall, easily 7 feet or more, with arms that hung down past where its knees should be. Its body seemed to flicker and shift, as if it was not entirely solid, or as if Jalen's eyes could not quite focus on it properly. She could not make out a face, only a smooth, featureless surface where a head should be. For hours, the thing circled her campsite, always remaining just at the edge of the light. It never spoke in its own voice, only using the stolen voices of people Jalen knew and loved. Sometimes, it would call her name. Other times, it would speak in full sentences, saying things that those people might actually say, trying to lure her away from the safety of the fire. Jalen sat rigid with terror, feeding log after log into the flames, determined not to let the fire die. As dawn approached, the figure finally retreated back into the forest. But Jalen knew with absolute certainty that it had not left. It was still out there, watching, waiting. She broke camp as quickly as possible, abandoning some of her gear in her desperate need to leave that place. The 8-mile hike back to her truck normally took about 4 hours. Jalen covered the distance in less than 3, practically running down the mountain trails. Throughout the entire descent, she could feel it following her. She never saw it directly, but her camera, which she had left running and attached to her backpack, captured dozens of images of the figure trailing behind her, always maintaining a distance of about 50 yards. In the daylight, it was even more disturbing to look at. The thing had no discernible features, no clothing, just a smooth shadow-like form that moved with an unnatural gliding motion that suggested it was not actually walking, but floating just above the ground. Only when Jalen reached her truck and drove away from that mountain did the presence finally lift. She looked in her rear-view mirror and saw the figure standing at the edge of the abandoned logging road, watching her vehicle disappear around a bend. That was the last time she saw it. But the memory of those 3 days has never left her. Jalen never returned to Blackwater Ridge. She submitted her resignation to the magazine within a week, claiming family emergency, and has since refused all assignments that would require her to spend nights alone in remote wilderness areas. She shared the photographs with several colleagues and paranormal researchers, but most dismissed them as tricks of light and shadow, or suggested that she had experienced some kind of psychological break brought on by isolation and stress. But Jalen knows what she encountered on that mountain. Something lives in those ancient Appalachian woods, something that should not exist according to any rational understanding of the world. It mimics human voices with perfect accuracy. It stalks its prey with inhuman patience, and it exists just at the edge of perception, never quite solid enough to be captured clearly, but undeniably real to those unlucky enough to encounter it. The hollow man of Blackwater Ridge is still out there, waiting in the darkness between the trees, calling out in voices that belong to the people you love, hoping that eventually someone will be foolish enough to answer. Kaylin had always been drawn to unsolved mysteries. As a freelance journalist specializing in cold cases, she had spent the better part of a decade investigating crimes that law enforcement had long since abandoned. Her work had helped bring closure to 3 families, and had even led to 1 arrest in a case that had been cold for 15 years. But nothing in her career had prepared her for what she would uncover in the remote wilderness surrounding Devil's Creek, a winding waterway that cut through some of the most isolated terrain in the Appalachian Mountains. The story began in March 2024, when Kaylin received an email from a woman named Patricia Henderson. Patricia's daughter, Emma, had disappeared while hiking the Devil's Creek Trail in October 2019. The official investigation had concluded that Emma had likely gotten lost and succumbed to exposure, a tragic but not uncommon fate for solo hikers in that unforgiving terrain. But Patricia refused to accept that explanation. Emma had been an experienced hiker with proper gear, a GPS device, and years of wilderness experience. More importantly, Emma had checked in via satellite phone just hours before her disappearance, reporting that she was ahead of schedule and would be back at the trailhead the following morning. She never arrived. Kaylin agreed to look into the case, initially expecting to find nothing more than the unfortunate result of a hiking accident. But as she began researching Devil's Creek, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Emma Henderson was not the only hiker to vanish in that area. Over the past 23 years, 11 people had disappeared along a 15-mile stretch of the Devil's Creek Trail. 11 people, all experienced hikers, all carrying proper equipment, all vanishing without a trace despite extensive search and rescue operations. The disappearances followed a chilling pattern. They occurred exclusively between September and November, always during the autumn months when the forest was at its most beautiful and the weather was still favorable for hiking. The victims ranged in age from 22 to 56, both men and women, all solo hikers who had filed proper trail plans with local authorities. In every single case, the hiker had made some form of contact, either by phone or through another hiker, within hours of their disappearance. And in every single case, despite searches involving dozens of volunteers, tracking dogs, and even helicopter surveillance, no bodies were ever recovered. What made the pattern even more disturbing was that law enforcement had never connected these cases. Because the disappearances occurred across different jurisdictions, involved different ranger districts, and were spread out over more than 2 decades, each incident had been investigated in isolation. Nobody had ever stepped back to look at the bigger picture, to see that all these missing persons cases were clustered along the same stretch of trail, occurring with eerie regularity every 2 to 3 years. Kaylin spent 3 months gathering every piece of information she could find about the missing hikers. She obtained police reports, interviewed family members, spoke with the search and rescue teams who had worked the cases, and compiled a detailed timeline of each disappearance. The more she learned, the more convinced she became that these were not accidents. Someone or something was hunting along that trail. In June 2024, Kaylin made the decision to hike the Devil's Creek Trail herself. She knew it was dangerous, possibly foolish, but she needed to see the terrain firsthand, to understand the geography, and try to identify locations where someone could potentially ambush unsuspecting hikers. She was careful in her preparations. She informed multiple people of her exact itinerary, carried 2 GPS devices and a satellite phone, and deliberately chose to hike in June, outside the September to November window, when all the previous disappearances had occurred. The Devil's Creek Trail was stunning. It wound through old-growth forest, past waterfalls, and limestone cliffs, offering breathtaking views of the surrounding mountains. But there was something unsettling about the place, a quality that Kaylin could not quite define. The trail was remarkably isolated. Despite hiking for 2 full days, she encountered no other people. The trailhead had shown only 3 vehicles when she arrived, and she had seen no evidence of other hikers anywhere along the route. On the 2nd day of her hike, about 9 miles from the trailhead, Kaylin discovered something that made her stop in her tracks. Just off the main trail, partially hidden by undergrowth, was a side path that did not appear on any of her maps. The path was narrow, barely wide enough for a single person, and appeared to be deliberately concealed. Branches had been arranged to obscure the entrance, and unless someone was specifically looking for it, they would walk right past without ever noticing it was there. Kaylin hesitated for a long moment before making the decision to follow the hidden path. She activated the emergency beacon on her GPS, ensuring that her location was being continuously broadcast, and began making her way down the narrow trail. The path wound through increasingly dense forest, descending into a hollow that was not marked on any of her topographic maps. After roughly a half a mile, the path opened into a small clearing. What Kaylin found in that clearing would haunt her for the rest of her life. Scattered throughout the area were personal items: hiking boots, backpacks, water bottles, a camera, a walking stick, a bright red rain jacket. Some of the items were weathered and faded, clearly having been exposed to the elements for years. Others looked relatively new. Kaylin approached cautiously, her heart pounding, and began photographing everything with her phone. She recognized some of the items from the missing persons. Reports she had studied. The red rain jacket had belonged to Michael Torres, who had disappeared in 2016. The camera was the same model that Jennifer Wu had been carrying when she vanished in 2011. The walking stick bore carved initials that matched those of David Brennan, missing since 2008. This was not just a collection of abandoned gear. This was a trophy cache. But what terrified Kaylin more than anything else was what she did not find. There were no remains, no bones, no evidence of what had actually happened to the hikers after their belongings had been taken. The clearing showed signs of regular use. The undergrowth was trampled down, and there was a makeshift fire pit surrounded by stones. Someone had been using this location repeatedly over many years. As Kaylin documented the scene, she became aware of a smell. It was faint at first, but growing stronger. The sickly sweet odor of decay coming from somewhere deeper in the hollow. Every instinct told her to leave immediately to get back to the main trail and call for help, but she had come this far, and she needed to know the truth. She followed the smell to a limestone outcropping at the far edge of the clearing. Behind the rocks, partially hidden by a rock overhang, was the entrance to a cave. Kaylin stood at the entrance of that cave for what felt like an eternity, wrestling with the decision of whether to go inside. The smell emanating from the darkness was overwhelming now, leaving no doubt about what she would find if she entered. She pulled out her flashlight and shone it into the opening. The beam of light revealed a narrow passage descending into the earth at a steep angle, and scattered along the floor of that passage were more personal items, deeper into the cave, as if they had been carried inside and then abandoned or lost. Before Kaylin could make a decision about whether to enter the cave, she heard something that froze her blood. Footsteps. Someone was coming down the hidden path, moving quickly through the forest. She had perhaps 30 seconds before whoever it was reached the clearing. Kaylin made a split-second decision. She ran to the far side of the clearing and concealed herself behind a massive fallen log, lying flat against the ground and holding her breath. A man emerged into the clearing. He was tall and lean, probably in his 50s, with weathered features and clothing that suggested he spent most of his time outdoors. He wore hunting camouflage and carried a large hunting knife on his belt. But what made Kaylin's heart nearly stop was what he was carrying in his hands. A woman's hiking boot, still relatively clean and new-looking, with mud on the sole that had not yet dried. The man walked directly to the pile of belongings and casually tossed the boot onto the collection. Then he stood there for a moment, surveying his cache with what could only be described as satisfaction. He pulled out a cigarette, lit it, and smoked while gazing at the stolen items. Kaylin remained absolutely motionless, barely breathing, praying that he would not notice the disturbance she had caused by examining the belongings. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes, the man finished his cigarette and walked toward the cave entrance. He disappeared inside, and Kaylin heard his footsteps echoing as he descended into the darkness. The moment he was out of sight, she moved. She ran back up the hidden path faster than she had ever run in her life, not caring about the noise she made, focused only on getting away from that horrible place. Kaylin reached the main trail and kept running. She ran for 3 miles before she finally felt safe enough to stop and make a call on her satellite phone. She contacted the Virginia State Police, reported her location, and told them exactly what she had found. She described the hidden path, the clearing, the cave, and most importantly, she described the man she had seen. Then she sat down on the trail and waited, shaking uncontrollably, knowing that she had just uncovered evidence of crimes that had been ongoing for more than 2 decades. The police response was immediate and massive. Within 6 hours, law enforcement from multiple agencies had converged on Devil's Creek. Officers hiked into the area, located the hidden path based on Kaylin's GPS coordinates and detailed description, and secured the clearing as a crime scene. What they found in the cave confirmed Kaylin's worst fears: the remains of multiple individuals in various states of decomposition, some dating back more than 15 years. The investigation that followed would take months to complete. The man Kaylin had seen was identified as Raymond Cobb, a local resident who owned property adjacent to the National Forest. Cobb had been a person of interest in several of the disappearances over the years, but there had never been enough evidence to obtain a search warrant for his property. Investigators had simply assumed he was a strange hermit who spent too much time in the woods. Nobody had ever suspected that he was actively hunting human prey along the Devil's Creek Trail. Forensic analysis eventually identified 9 of the 11 missing hikers. The remains matched dental records and DNA samples provided by family members. 2 sets of remains could not be definitively identified, suggesting that Cobb's crimes may have extended even further back than investigators had initially realized, possibly including victims whose disappearances had never been reported or had occurred in different areas. Raymond Cobb was arrested at his home without incident. During questioning, he showed no remorse and actually seemed proud of what he had accomplished. He described in chilling detail how he would scout the trail during peak hiking season, identify solo hikers, and then follow them to remote sections where he could attack without witnesses. He had intimate knowledge of the terrain, including numerous hidden paths and caves that allowed him to move through the forest unseen. He had been perfecting his technique for over 20 years, learning from early mistakes and becoming increasingly sophisticated in his methods. The trial was one of the most heavily publicized criminal cases in Virginia history. Cobb was ultimately convicted on 9 counts of first-degree murder and received 9 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The families of the victims finally received the closure they had been seeking for years, though nothing could truly compensate for the loss of their loved ones or the horrific manner in which they had died. For Kaylin, the investigation changed everything. She received recognition for her work, including awards from several journalism organizations. But she found no satisfaction in the accolades. She could not stop thinking about the victims, about the terror they must have felt in their final moments, about the years they had spent missing while their killer walked free. She thought about how close she had come to becoming victim number 12, and how many more people might have died if she had not decided to follow that hidden path. The Devil's Creek Trail was closed indefinitely following the investigation. The Forest Service conducted extensive searches of the surrounding area, looking for additional crime scenes or evidence of other victims. They found 2 more hidden caches of belongings, though thankfully no additional remains. The trail has since been reopened, but few people choose to hike it anymore. The beautiful autumn forest will forever be associated with the horrors that occurred there. A reminder that sometimes the greatest dangers in the wilderness are not the bears or the weather or the treacherous terrain, but the darkness that exists in the human heart. Janae had never believed in anything she could not explain through science. As a graduate student in atmospheric physics at Virginia Tech, she approached the world with a methodical skepticism that left little room for supernatural explanations. UFOs were weather balloons or experimental aircraft. Ghost sightings were tricks of light and shadow combined with overactive imaginations. Cryptids were misidentified animals or outright hoaxes. But what happened on Laurel Mountain in September 2023 shattered every rational framework she had built around her understanding of reality. The camping trip had been planned for months. Janae and 3 of her friends from college, Marcus, Bethany, and Cole, had decided to spend a long weekend hiking and camping in a remote section of the Appalachian Mountains. They had chosen Laurel Mountain specifically because of its isolation and the reportedly spectacular views from the summit. The area was far enough from any major towns that light pollution would be minimal, making it perfect for stargazing, which was one of Janae's favorite hobbies. They arrived at the trailhead on a Friday afternoon in mid-September, when the early autumn weather was perfect for camping. The temperature was mild, the forecast called for clear skies, and the forest was just beginning to show the first hints of fall color. The hike to their chosen campsite took about 3 hours, following a moderately difficult trail that wound through dense hardwood forest, before emerging onto a ridge with panoramic views of the surrounding mountains. The group set up camp in a small clearing about 100 yards below the summit. By the time they had their tents erected and dinner prepared, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. They sat around their campfire, talking and laughing, enjoying the peace and isolation of the wilderness. As darkness fell, the stars began to emerge, more numerous and brilliant than anything visible from the city. Janae pointed out constellations and explained the science behind various astronomical phenomena, falling easily into her role as the group's resident expert on all things celestial. Around 10:30, Bethany noticed something strange. She pointed toward the northern horizon, where a faint light had appeared above the distant tree line. At first, it looked like a bright star, or possibly Venus, which was visible in the evening sky that time of year. But as they watched, the light began to move. It drifted slowly from left to right, maintaining a constant altitude above the horizon, pulsing gently as it traveled. Janae immediately offered an explanation. It was probably a satellite, or the International Space Station making a pass overhead, but Marcus disagreed. He had spent time in the military and was familiar with aircraft of all types. The light was moving too slowly to be a plane and following an irregular path that was inconsistent with satellite behavior. As they debated possibilities, two more lights appeared, merging from the same section of sky as the first. These lights were different colors, one distinctly green and the other a deep red, and they seemed to be following the original white light. The three lights moved in formation across the sky, maintaining their relative positions as they traveled from north to south. They made no sound whatsoever, which ruled out any conventional aircraft. Helicopters and planes were always audible from that distance, especially in the stillness of the mountain night. But these lights were completely silent, gliding through the darkness, like luminous fish swimming through an invisible ocean. Cole grabbed his phone and began recording video, though they all knew the camera would never capture what they were seeing with the clarity their eyes perceived. The lights continued their journey across the sky, and as they passed almost directly overhead, they stopped. All three lights simply froze in place, hovering motionless above the mountain. The group stood in stunned silence, staring upward, no longer offering explanations because none of them had any idea what they were witnessing. Then the lights began to descend. Slowly, almost tentatively, they dropped lower in the sky, moving toward the mountain itself. Janae felt her heart rate accelerate as she realized the lights were coming down somewhere very close to their location, possibly even on Laurel Mountain itself. The rational part of her brain was screaming that there had to be a logical explanation, that lights in the sky did not simply descend onto remote mountaintops. But the evidence of her own eyes could not be denied. The lights disappeared below the tree line, somewhere on the far side of the mountain, perhaps half a mile from their campsite. For several minutes, nobody spoke. They simply stared in the direction where the lights had vanished, waiting to see if they would reappear. When they did not, Marcus voiced what they were all thinking. They should go investigate. They should hike over to that side of the mountain and try to figure out what those lights had been. Janae's scientific curiosity warred with her common sense. It was nearly 11 at night. They would be hiking through unfamiliar forest in the dark, and they had no idea what they might find. But the opportunity to potentially explain a genuine mystery was too compelling to ignore. After a brief debate, they reached a compromise. They would wait until first light, and then hike over to investigate the area where the lights had descended. If they found nothing, at least they would have tried. None of them slept well that night. Janae lay in her tent, staring at the nylon ceiling, replaying what she had witnessed over and over in her mind. She ran through every possible explanation she could think of. Drones, but the lights had been too large and too high. Flares, but they had moved in ways that defied gravity. Some kind of atmospheric phenomenon, but nothing in her studies had ever described anything remotely similar. By the time dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, she had convinced herself that they would find some mundane explanation once they reached the site. The group set out at first light, hiking along the ridgeline before descending into the valley on the far side of Laurel Mountain. The terrain was rugged with no established trails, forcing them to pick their way carefully through thick undergrowth and around massive boulders. After about 45 minutes of difficult hiking, Cole suddenly stopped and pointed ahead. Through the trees, they could see an area where the forest canopy appeared to be damaged, with several large branches broken and hanging at odd angles. As they approached the damaged area, they emerged into a clearing that should not have existed. The space was roughly circular, perhaps 80 feet in diameter, and it looked as if something massive had pressed down on the vegetation from above. Small trees were bent and broken, all leaning outward from the center of the circle. The grass and undergrowth were flattened in a pattern that radiated from a central point. And most disturbing of all, the ground itself appeared to be scorched, with patches of earth that had been heated to the point where the soil had fused into a glass-like substance. Janae knelt down and examined the scorched earth more closely. The heat required to vitrify soil was extreme, well over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Nothing natural could have created this effect, and certainly not without starting a massive forest fire. She pulled out her phone and began taking photographs, documenting every detail of the clearing. The others spread out, exploring the perimeter and looking for any additional clues about what had happened here. Bethany was the one who found the symbols. Carved into the bark of several trees around the clearing were strange markings, geometric shapes that resembled no written language any of them recognized. The carvings appeared fresh, with raw wood visible where bark had been removed. The symbols were arranged in vertical columns, 6 symbols on each of 4 trees positioned at what appeared to be the cardinal points around the clearing. Marcus used his phone to photograph the symbols, and Janae found herself feeling increasingly unsettled. Whatever had happened in this clearing, it was not random. The scorched earth, the damaged vegetation, the carefully placed symbols, they all suggested intentionality, purpose behind the event. But purpose implied intelligence, and accepting that meant accepting that something with intelligence and technology far beyond human capability had landed on this mountain the previous night. As the group continued to explore the clearing, Cole made another discovery that sent chills down all their spines. Pressed into the soft earth near the center of the circle were impressions that might have been tracks. They were not animal prints, at least not from any animal native to the Appalachian Mountains. The impressions were roughly triangular, about 18 inches long, with 3 distinct toe-like projections. There were 5 separate impressions arranged in a pattern that suggested something had walked or stood in that location. Janae took measurements and photographs of the prints, her hands shaking slightly as she worked. Every piece of evidence they were documenting defied conventional explanation. She found herself thinking about the reports she'd always dismissed, the countless UFO sightings and close encounter stories that she had attributed to misidentification and hysteria. Had she been wrong? Had there been genuine phenomena occurring all along, phenomena that science simply could not yet explain? The group spent nearly 2 hours in the clearing, documenting everything they could find. They collected soil samples from the scorched areas, took rubbings of the carved symbols, and recorded extensive video of the entire site. As they worked, Janae noticed something else unusual. Her compass was behaving erratically, the needle spinning slowly rather than pointing steadily north. She pulled out the GPS unit from her backpack and found that it was also malfunctioning, unable to acquire a satellite signal despite the clear view of the sky from the clearing. Finally, as the morning sun climbed higher and the temperature began to rise, they made the decision to head back to their campsite. They hiked in silence, each person lost in their own thoughts about what they had witnessed. When they reached their camp, they discovered that all their electronic devices had drained batteries, despite having been fully charged the night before. Marcus's phone was completely dead. Bethany's camera would not power on. Even Janae's backup GPS unit showed 0 battery life, though it had been brand new and unused. The group packed up their camp and hiked back to the trailhead much faster than they had arrived, driven by a shared but unspoken desire to leave Laurel Mountain behind. They drove back to Blacksburg in relative silence, occasionally discussing what they had seen but unable to reach any conclusions that made sense within their understanding of the world. In the weeks that followed, Janae struggled with what to do about their discovery. She knew that reporting it would subject them all to ridicule. UFO witnesses were not taken seriously in academic circles. and she had worked too hard building her reputation to risk it on something so controversial. But she also could not ignore the evidence. The photographs were real. The physical effects they had documented were real. Something had happened on that mountain, something that demanded investigation. Eventually, Janae made the decision to submit an anonymous report to several organizations that investigated unexplained phenomena. She included selected photographs and a detailed written account of their experience, carefully omitting any identifying information. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Investigators wanted to know the exact location, wanted to visit the site themselves, wanted to interview the witnesses, but Janae refused to provide additional details, afraid of the attention it would bring. She did share the carved symbols with a colleague in the linguistics department, claiming they were from an old historical site she had discovered while hiking. The colleague spent weeks analyzing the symbols and finally admitted that they resembled no known writing system, ancient or modern. The geometric patterns had mathematical properties that suggested they might represent some form of language or code, but without additional context, they were impossible to translate. To this day, Janae does not know what she and her friends witnessed on Laurel Mountain. She has returned to the site twice, alone, but found the clearing overgrown and showing no signs of the damage they had documented. The scorched earth had been covered by new vegetation, the broken trees had healed or been reclaimed by the forest, and the carved symbols had been obscured by new bark growth. It was as if nature itself was conspiring to erase the evidence of what had occurred. But Janae still has the photographs and the soil samples. She still remembers the lights descending from the sky with impossible grace and silence. And she knows with absolute certainty that the universe contains mysteries the science has not yet begun to understand. Whatever landed on Laurel Mountain that September night was real, and somewhere in the vast darkness above the Appalachian peaks, it may still be watching and waiting. Jaslyn had been hiking the Appalachian backcountry for nearly a decade, and she prided herself on meticulous preparation. Before every trip, she studied topographic maps, researched trail conditions, and plotted her route with GPS precision. She had explored hundreds of miles of wilderness across multiple states, and she had never once gotten lost. That perfect record made what happened in November 2023 all the more disturbing, because the cabin she found that day existed on no map, in no database, and according to every official record, should not have been there at all. The hike had started as a routine solo backpacking trip through a remote section of the mountains in eastern Kentucky. Jaslyn had planned a 3-day loop that would take her through old-growth forest and along a series of ridgelines offering spectacular views. The weather forecast was favorable, cold but clear, typical for late autumn in the mountains. She set out from the trailhead early on a Saturday morning, her pack loaded with everything she would need for 3 days of self-sufficient wilderness travel. The first day passed without incident. Jaslyn covered nearly 12 miles, stopping frequently to photograph the stark beauty of the late autumn forest. Most of the leaves had fallen, leaving the trees skeletal against the gray sky, and there was a particular quality to the light that she found hauntingly beautiful. She made camp that evening near a small creek, ate a simple dinner, and fell asleep to the sound of water flowing over stones. The second day was when everything went wrong. Jaslyn woke to discover that a dense fog had rolled in overnight, reducing visibility to less than 50 feet. She consulted her maps and GPS, confident that she could navigate despite the poor visibility. The trail was well marked, and she had hiked in fog many times before. She broke camp and continued along the planned route, checking her GPS every few minutes to ensure she was staying on track. Around mid-morning, roughly 2 hours into her hike, Jaslyn noticed that the trail markers had become inconsistent. She would spot a blaze on a tree, follow the indicated direction, and then go several hundred yards without seeing another marker. Her GPS showed she was still following the correct general bearing, but something felt off. The terrain did not quite match what the topographic map indicated she should be encountering. After another hour of increasingly uncertain navigation, Jaslyn admitted to herself that she was no longer entirely sure of her location. The fog had grown even thicker, and the forest around her looked unfamiliar. She stopped to take a proper GPS reading and discovered something that made her stomach tighten with anxiety. According to the device, she was nearly a mile off course, in an area the map showed as particularly rugged and trailless terrain. Jaslyn made the decision to backtrack, to retrace her steps until she found a landmark she recognized. But as she turned around and began walking back the way she had come, she quickly realized that the fog was completely disorienting her. She could not be certain she was actually traveling in the opposite direction. The forest looked the same in every direction, just endless gray trunks disappearing into white mist. She was trying to decide on the best course of action when she saw it through the fog, a structure barely visible about 100 yards ahead. Jaslyn felt a wave of relief. A building meant people, or at least a trail or road that would help her get reoriented. She walked toward the structure, and as she got closer, she realized it was a cabin. An old cabin constructed from hand-hewn logs, with a stone chimney and a steeply pitched roof. The cabin looked abandoned but structurally sound. There were no broken windows, no holes in the roof, no obvious signs of decay. Jaslyn approached cautiously, calling out to see if anyone was home. No response came from inside. She walked up to the front door and knocked. Still nothing. The door was not locked, so after another moment of hesitation, she pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior of the cabin was a snapshot from another era. The single large room contained furniture that looked like it dated from the 1940s. A wood-burning stove, a simple table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed frame with a thin mattress, and shelves lined with canned goods and supplies. Everything was covered with a fine layer of dust, but not the thick accumulation that would be expected if the place had been abandoned for decades. It looked like someone had been living here recently, perhaps within the past few months. On the table was a kerosene lamp, matches, and a leather-bound journal. Jaslyn picked up the journal and opened it. The pages were filled with handwritten entries, dated and detailed, describing daily life in the cabin. She flipped to the most recent entry and felt her blood run cold. The date written at the top of the page was October 15th, 1947. That was impossible. The journal had to be a replica, or someone was playing an elaborate joke. But as Jaslyn flipped through the pages, she found herself becoming less certain. The paper felt genuinely old, yellowed and brittle at the edges. The ink had faded to a rusty brown color, consistent with age, and the handwriting, the distinctive cursive style, was exactly what one would expect from someone educated in the early 20th century. The entries described the life of a man named Thomas, who had apparently come to this cabin to escape something. The early entries were mundane, discussing hunting, maintaining the cabin, and surviving the harsh mountain winters. But as Jaslyn read further, the tone of the entries changed. Thomas began writing about hearing voices at night, about seeing figures moving through the trees around the cabin, about feeling watched whenever he stepped outside. The final entry, dated October 15, 1947, was brief and chilling. "They are at the door. I can hear them scratching to get in. I do not think I will see morning." Jaslyn closed the journal, her hand shaking slightly. She looked around the cabin with new eyes, noticing details she had missed on first inspection. There were scratch marks on the inside of the door, deep gouges in the wood, as if something had been trying desperately to get out or prevent something from getting in. The single window was covered with boards nailed from the inside. And now that she was paying attention, there was a smell in the cabin, faint but distinct, the musty odor of decay. She walked to the shelves and examined the canned goods. The labels were vintage, brands she did not recognize, with designs and typography from the mid-20th century. Some of the cans were rusted and bulging, clearly decades old. On one shelf was a radio, a large vacuum tube model that would have been state-of-the-art in the 1940s. Jaslyn tried turning the dial, not expecting it to work, and was startled when static crackled from the speaker. She spun the dial slowly, searching for a signal, and suddenly a voice emerged from the static. A man's voice, speaking in the formal, precise accent of a 1940s radio announcer, was describing news events. He was talking about President Truman, about post-war reconstruction, about events that had happened nearly 80 years ago. Jaslyn stood frozen, listening to the impossible broadcast, her rational mind screaming that this could not be real. Then the broadcast was interrupted by another voice. This one was rough, desperate, unmistakably terrified. "Is anyone out there? Can anyone hear me? My name is Thomas Brennan. I'm trapped in a cabin in the mountains. Something is outside. It has been circling the cabin for 3 days. Please, if anyone can hear this, send help." The voice cut off, replaced by static. Then the original announcer's voice returned as if the interruption had never occurred. Jaslyn backed away from the radio, her heart pounding. She turned toward the door, suddenly desperate to get out of the cabin, to get back to familiar territory, to escape whatever this place was. As she reached for the door handle, she heard it. A sound from outside, barely audible over the whisper of wind through the trees. Scratching. Something was scratching at the exterior wall of the cabin. Jaslyn froze, listening intently. The scratching moved along the wall, slow and deliberate, making its way toward the door. She looked around frantically for another exit, but there was none. The window was boarded shut, and even if she could tear the boards away, it would take time and make noise. The scratching reached the door and stopped. In the silence that followed, Jaslyn could hear her own breathing, rapid and shallow. Then came a sound that nearly stopped her heart. The doorknob began to turn. Jaslyn did the only thing she could think of. She grabbed the heavy wooden chair from the table and wedged it under the doorknob, bracing the door shut. The knob continued to turn, testing the resistance, and then something began pushing against the door, not forcefully but persistently, as if whatever was outside had all the time in the world, and knew that eventually the barrier would fail. She backed away from the door, looking for anything that could be used as a weapon. On a shelf near the bed, she spotted a hunting knife in a leather sheath. She grabbed it and drew the blade, taking some small comfort from the weight of the weapon in her hand. The pushing against the door continued, rhythmic and patient, for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Jaslyn stood in the center of that cabin, knife in hand, watching the door flex with each push from outside. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the pushing stopped. The scratching resumed, moving away from the door, traveling along the wall, fading into the distance. Jaslyn waited, listening intently, afraid to move or make any sound. After several minutes of silence, she cautiously approached the window and peered through a gap in the boards. The fog had begun to lift, and through the dissipating mist, she could see the forest beyond. Nothing moved. No figure lurked among the trees. Whatever had been outside appeared to be gone. She made a decision. She had to leave this place immediately. She removed the chair from the door, gripped the knife tightly, took a deep breath, and pulled the door open. The clearing in front of the cabin was empty. She stepped outside, every sense on high alert, and began walking quickly away from the cabin. Jaslyn had not gone more than 50 yards when she looked back. The cabin was gone. Where it had stood just moments before, there was nothing but forest. No clearing, no structure, no sign that a building had ever existed in that location. She stood staring at the empty woods, trying to process what she was seeing, wondering if she had somehow become turned around. But the trees where the cabin should have been were old growth, centuries old, showing no evidence of ever having been disturbed. She pulled out her GPS and checked her location. According to the device, she was standing in the middle of an area marked as roadless wilderness, miles from the nearest structure of any kind. Her hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped the GPS. She forced herself to focus, to follow the compass bearing that would take her back to the main trail. It took Jaslyn 6 hours to hike out of that forest. She pushed herself hard, stopping only when absolutely necessary, driven by a primal need to escape those mountains. When she finally reached her vehicle at the trailhead, she sat in the driver's seat for a long time, trying to convince herself that what she had experienced could be explained rationally. Exhaustion, hypoxia from the altitude, some kind of hallucinogenic plant she had accidentally touched. But as she started the engine and prepared to drive away, she reached into her pocket and pulled out something that made all those rationalizations crumble. The hunting knife from the cabin. It was real, solid, impossibly present. The leather sheath was cracked and aged, the blade pitted with rust, and carved into the wooden handle was a name, Thomas Brennan. Indiana had always been fascinated by the hidden history of the Appalachian Mountains. As a documentary filmmaker specializing in regional folklore and forgotten history, she had spent years researching the stories that never made it into official records, the tales of feuds and violence, of bootleggers and revenuers, of isolated communities that operated by their own rules far from the reach of law enforcement. In the spring of 2024, while researching material for a documentary about Prohibition-era moonshining operations, Indiana stumbled onto a story that had been deliberately buried for over 70 years. It began with a chance conversation at a diner in a small town nestled deep in the mountains of eastern Tennessee. Indiana had stopped for lunch and struck up a conversation with an elderly waitress named Dorothy, who mentioned that her grandfather had been involved in the moonshine trade back in the 1930s and 40s. Most people in the region had some connection to that history, and Dorothy seemed happy to share stories about the old days. But when Indiana mentioned that she was particularly interested in the violent conflicts between rival moonshining families, Dorothy's demeanor changed. She became quiet and glanced around nervously, as if worried about being overheard. Then she leaned in close and whispered a name that Indiana should look into if she wanted a real story: the Taggart family, and specifically what had happened in Copper Hollow in August 1952. Dorothy would say nothing more, only that Indiana should talk to the older residents of the area if she wanted to know the truth. But she warned that people did not like discussing what had happened in Copper Hollow, and that asking too many questions might not be welcome. Indiana thanked her for the information and spent the rest of the afternoon trying to find references to the Taggart family in Copper Hollow in local historical records. What she found was strange. There were references to the Taggart family in records from the 1920s through the early 1950s, mostly related to property ownership and the occasional arrest for bootlegging. But after August 1952, the family name simply disappeared from all official records. No property transfers, no death certificates, no marriage licenses, nothing. It was as if the entire family had ceased to exist on a single date. Even stranger was what she found about Copper Hollow itself. The location appeared on older maps as a small settlement, about 8 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a rough dirt road that wound through the mountains. But on maps produced after 1952, Copper Hollow was no longer marked. The settlement had been erased from official cartography, though the hollow itself, a narrow valley between two ridges, obviously still existed. Indiana spent the next 2 weeks interviewing elderly residents of the surrounding area, gradually piecing together fragments of a story that no one seemed willing to tell in its entirety. The Taggart family had operated one of the most successful moonshining operations in the region, producing high-quality whiskey that was distributed across multiple states. Their operation in Copper Hollow included several large stills and storage facilities, and at its peak employed nearly 20 people, but the Taggarts had made enemies. Another family, the Crawfords, operated a competing moonshine business and resented the Taggarts' dominance of the regional market. The rivalry between the two families had simmered for years, marked by occasional violence and sabotage, but had never escalated into open warfare. That changed in the summer of 1952. According to the fragmentary accounts Indiana collected, someone had betrayed the location of the Taggart operation to federal revenue agents. A raid was planned, but before it could be executed, the Taggarts discovered they had been betrayed. They learned that Lucas Crawford had provided the information to the authorities in exchange for immunity for his own operation. What happened next was described in whispers, with people reluctant to provide specific details. On the night of August 15, 1952, multiple members of the Taggart family traveled to the Crawford homestead. What occurred there was described variously as a massacre, an execution, and a slaughter. 7 members of the Crawford family died that night, including Lucas Crawford, his wife, his brother, and 4 others. The violence was extreme, brutal, and according to those willing to discuss it at all, involved torture before the final killings. But the story did not end there. 3 days later, on August 18th, a fire destroyed every structure in Copper Hollow. The Taggart homestead, the distillery buildings, the storage sheds, everything burned to the ground. And when authorities finally reached the remote hollow, they found bodies. 11 members of the Taggart family, dead in the ruins. The official report listed the cause of death as accidental, victims of the fire, but the few people who had seen the bodies told a different story. Indiana found one former deputy sheriff, now in his 90s and living in a nursing home, who had been part of the investigation. He was reluctant to talk at first, but eventually shared what he had witnessed that day. The bodies had not died in the fire. They had been killed before the fire started, shot at close range. But what disturbed him most was the arrangement of the bodies. They had been positioned deliberately, laid out in a circle in what had been the main room of the Taggart house, with symbols carved into the floor around them. The deputy described the symbols as similar to the hex signs used in Pennsylvania Dutch folk magic, but more complex and disturbing. He said the investigating officers had been instructed to photograph and document the scene, and then never speak of what they had found. The official narrative was that the fire had been accidental, that the Taggarts had died trying to escape, and that any connection to the Crawford murders was purely speculative. The case was closed within a week, and everyone involved was told to move on. Indiana knew she needed to see Copper Hollow for herself. Using old maps and GPS coordinates, she located the approximate position of the former settlement and obtained permission to access the private land where it had stood. In early May, she hiked into the hollow, accompanied by a local guide named Ray who knew the area well. The site of Copper Hollow was overgrown with 70 years of forest regrowth, but evidence of the settlement was still visible. Foundation stones marked where buildings had once stood, and Indiana could make out the remains of what had been a road winding through the hollow. But what struck her most was the atmosphere of the place. There was a heaviness in the air, a quality of wrongness that she could not quite articulate but felt viscerally. Ray seemed to feel it too. He had been quiet during the hike in, but once they reached the hollow, he became increasingly agitated. He told Indiana they should not stay long, that this was not a good place, but Indiana was determined to explore thoroughly and document what remained. She began photographing the ruins, paying particular attention to the largest foundation, which had presumably been the Taggart house. As she examined the site where the house had stood, Indiana noticed something unusual. In one section where the foundation stones were still intact, there were markings carved into the rock. She cleared away decades of leaf litter and exposed a series of symbols, similar to what the deputy had described seeing on the floor before the fire. They were arranged in a circular pattern, approximately 8 feet in diameter, with more complex designs at specific points around the circle. Indiana photographed the symbols extensively, using different angles and lighting to capture as much detail as possible. As she worked, Ray called out to her from the edge of the hollow. He had found something. Indiana joined him and saw what he had discovered. a small cemetery, unmarked and hidden by undergrowth, containing approximately 20 graves. The graves were marked only by rough stones, with no names or dates. They spent the next hour documenting the cemetery, and it was during this work that Indiana made her most disturbing discovery. Near the edge of the cemetery, partially buried in the soil, was a metal box. It was rusted but intact, roughly the size of a shoebox. Indiana carefully extracted it from the ground and opened it. Inside was a collection of items that made her hands begin to shake. There were photographs showing people she did not recognize, posed in front of the buildings that had once stood in this hollow. There were newspaper clippings about the Crawford murders, with certain passages underlined in red ink. And there was a handwritten letter, dated August 17, 1952, one day before the fire. The letter was addressed to no one in particular, and its contents were chilling. The author, who identified himself as Robert Taggart, described in detail what the family had done to the Crawfords. He wrote about the planning, the execution, and the satisfaction he felt in avenging what he saw as a betrayal. But then the tone of the letter changed. Robert wrote that the family had been cursed, that something had followed them back from the Crawford homestead, that they could all feel it in the hollow watching them, waiting. He described how family members were seeing things, hearing voices, experiencing vivid nightmares of their victims. The final paragraph of the letter stated that the family had decided to perform a ritual, something Robert called a cleansing, to rid themselves of whatever darkness they had brought back with them. He wrote that if anyone found this letter, they should know that the Taggarts had accepted responsibility for their actions and were prepared to pay whatever price was necessary. The letter ended abruptly, mid-sentence, as if the writer had been interrupted. Indiana sat back on her heels, processing what she had read. The official story of accidental death was clearly false. Something had happened here, something that involved ritual and intent. Whether the Taggarts had been murdered by someone seeking revenge for the Crawford killings or whether they had performed some kind of suicide pact was unclear, but the evidence suggested that whatever occurred in Copper Hollow that night was anything but accidental. As the afternoon shadows grew longer, Ray became increasingly insistent that they needed to leave. Indiana agreed, but as they were packing up their equipment, she heard something that made her freeze. Voices, distant but distinct, coming from deeper in the hollow. Multiple voices speaking in overlapping tones that made it impossible to distinguish individual words. Ray heard them too. His face went pale and he grabbed Indiana's arm, pulling her toward the trail out of the hollow. They hiked out quickly, not quite running, but moving faster than was safe on the rough terrain. The voices followed them for the first half-mile, always at the same distance, never getting closer, but never fading away. Only when they finally climbed out of the hollow and onto the ridge above did the voices stop. Indiana returned to town that evening, shaken but determined to continue her research. She had the photographs, the letter, and hours of recorded interviews. She had evidence of crimes that had been covered up for decades. But when she began trying to verify information and reach out to authorities, she encountered resistance. People who had been willing to talk to her suddenly refused to take her calls. The nursing home where the retired deputy lived informed her that he had passed away, though he had been in good health just days before. Most disturbing of all was what happened to the photographs she had taken of the symbols carved into the foundation stones. When she downloaded the images from her camera, every single photo of the symbols was corrupted, showing only static and distortion. The other photographs from that day were fine, clear, and usable. Only the images of the symbols had been affected, as if something had deliberately erased them. Indiana eventually completed her documentary, but she left out most of what she had learned about Copper Hollow. The story was too dark, too unresolved, and too dangerous. She kept the metal box and its contents locked away, physical proof of events that no one wanted to acknowledge. And sometimes, late at night, she thinks she can still hear those voices from the hollow, calling out across the decades, unwilling or unable to rest. Dalen had lived his entire life in the shadow of the Appalachian Mountains, working as a park ranger for over 15 years. He had seen almost everything the wilderness could throw at people: lost hikers, bear encounters, severe weather events, medical emergencies miles from the nearest road. He prided himself on remaining calm under pressure, on being the steady presence that others could rely on during crisis situations. But nothing in his training or experience had prepared him for the phenomenon that occurred in Whispering Valley, or for the people who vanished into the silence. Whispering Valley was a remote hollow in western North Carolina, accessible only by a single gravel road that wound through miles of national forest. The valley itself was approximately 3 miles long and half a mile wide, flanked by steep ridges on both sides. A small community of about 40 residents lived in scattered homesteads throughout the valley, mostly families who had been there for generations, living a lifestyle that had changed little over the past century. The first report came in October 2023. A resident named Margaret called the ranger station to report a strange fog that had rolled into the valley. Fog itself was not unusual in the mountains, especially during autumn when temperature inversions were common. But Margaret insisted this fog was different. She described it as unnaturally dense, with a quality that she struggled to articulate. Dalen took down her information and assured her that the fog would likely dissipate within a few hours as the day warmed. But the fog did not dissipate. It remained throughout the day, and when Dalen drove out to the valley that evening to check on the situation, he encountered something that immediately struck him as wrong. The fog began abruptly at the entrance to the valley, like a wall of white vapor that completely obscured everything beyond. He had never seen fog with such a distinct boundary. Weather patterns did not work that way. Fog drifted and dispersed gradually. It did not form precise borders. Dalen radioed back to the station to report what he was observing, then slowly drove into the fog. Visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. He crept along the road at walking speed, his headlights barely penetrating the dense white curtain. But what disturbed him more than the visibility was the silence. The moment he entered the fog, all sound ceased. His truck's engine, which had been running loud and rough as it always did, suddenly became completely inaudible. He could feel the vibration of the motor through the steering wheel, but he could hear nothing. He tried honking the horn. He pressed the button and saw the mechanism activate, but no sound emerged. He shouted and felt his vocal cords vibrate, but heard nothing. It was as if the fog was absorbing every sound wave, creating a bubble of absolute silence. The sensation was profoundly disorienting, triggering a primal anxiety that he had to consciously fight down. Dalen continued driving until he reached Margaret's house, guided more by memory of the road than by what he could see. He parked and walked to the front door, knocking loudly. Margaret opened the door, and he could see her speaking, her mouth forming words, but no sound reached his ears. The effect was like watching a television with the volume muted. He gestured for her to come outside, and together they stood in the yard, attempting to communicate through hand signals. After several minutes of this impossible conversation, Dalen decided to return to his truck and drive back out of the valley. He needed to report this to his superiors and figure out what was happening. But as he turned to leave, Margaret grabbed his arm and pointed toward the tree line. Dalen followed her gesture and saw a movement in the fog. A figure was walking through the white vapor, moving in an odd, stumbling manner. They both ran toward the figure, and as they got closer, Dalen recognized him as Frank, another valley resident who lived about a mile down the road. Frank's face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. His mouth was moving rapidly, as if he was shouting, but like everything else in the fog, his voice produced no sound. Frank grabbed Dalen's jacket and began pulling him back toward his truck with surprising strength, his movements frantic. Dalen allowed himself to be led back to the truck, and all three of them climbed inside. The moment the doors closed, sound returned. Not the muted, dampened sounds that one might expect, but full, normal volume. Frank immediately began speaking, his words tumbling out in a rush of panic. He described walking into the fog and becoming disoriented. He had tried calling out for help, but could not hear his own voice. He had walked for what felt like hours, unable to find his way back to his house, unable to hear any landmarks that might orient him. What disturbed Dalen most was Frank's description of time. He claimed he had been walking in the fog for at least 4 or 5 hours, but according to Dalen's watch, Frank had left his house only 30 minutes earlier. Margaret confirmed that she had seen Frank leave, and the timeline did not match Frank's experience. Somehow, time inside the fog was passing differently than outside, or at least it felt that way to those inside it. Dalen drove both residents back to the entrance of the valley, and all 3 of them emerged from the fog to the normal world beyond. The boundary was still sharp and distinct, and the moment they crossed it, they could hear normal forest sounds again. Birds, wind, the crunch of gravel under the tires. It was like crossing from one reality into another. Over the next week, the fog remained. It never expanded beyond the boundaries of the valley, but it never dissipated either. It simply sat there, a dense white mass that defied all normal meteorological explanation. Dalen coordinated with his superiors to evacuate the valley residents. One by one, families drove out or were escorted out by rangers. Most reported the same experiences: complete silence inside the fog, severe disorientation, and a distorted sense of time. But 3 residents refused to leave. 2 elderly brothers who had lived in the valley their entire lives insisted they would not abandon their home. And a woman named Sarah, who lived alone at the far end of the valley, could not be reached. Attempts to drive to her property resulted in rangers becoming hopelessly lost in the fog, unable to navigate even with GPS, which appeared to malfunction inside the fog boundary. On the 8th day, Dalen volunteered to make another attempt to reach Sarah. He went in alone, driving slowly, marking his route with reflective tape tied to trees every 50 feet so he could find his way back. The silence inside the fog was as absolute and disturbing as it had been on his first entry. He drove for what his watch said was 20 minutes but felt like 2 hours, finally reaching Sarah's property. The house was empty. The door was unlocked, the interior undisturbed, but Sarah was gone. Her car was still parked in the driveway. Her belongings were all in place, but there was no sign of Sarah herself. Dalen searched the property and the surrounding area, calling out despite knowing his voice made no sound, looking for any indication of where she might have gone. He was about to give up and return to his truck when he noticed something at the edge of the property. Footprints in the soft earth, leading away from the house and toward the tree line. The prints were small, consistent with Sarah's size, but the stride was wrong. The distance between prints was too great, as if she had been running or taking impossibly long steps. Dalen followed the prints into the forest. The trail led deeper into the fog, winding between trees, climbing up the slope toward the ridge. Dalen followed for approximately a quarter mile before the footprints simply stopped. Not at any landmark or obstacle, but in the middle of a stretch of open forest floor. One moment there were clear prints in the soil, the next moment nothing. It was as if Sarah had vanished mid-stride, lifted into the air, or ceased to exist. Dalen stood at the point where the footprints ended, turning slowly in a circle, looking for any explanation. That was when he saw them. Figures in the fog, standing motionless between the trees. At first he thought they were other people, perhaps searchers, who had come to help look for Sarah. But as he looked more closely, he realized these figures were wrong. They were too tall, their proportions subtly off, and they stood with an unnatural stillness that no living person could maintain. There were 5 of them, arranged in a rough circle around his position, each standing perhaps 30 yards away. Dalen felt fear spike through his chest. He slowly backed away, keeping all 5 figures in view as much as possible. They did not move or follow, they simply stood there, watching. He continued backing up until he reached the trail he had followed, then turned and walked as quickly as he dared back toward Sarah's house. The figures did not follow him, but he had the distinct sensation of being watched for the entire journey back. When he reached his truck, he wasted no time. He started the engine, turned around, and followed his marked trail back toward the valley entrance. Only when he emerged from the fog and sound returned to the world did he allow himself to breathe normally again. Dalen reported what he had seen, but his supervisors were skeptical. The stress of the situation was affecting everyone's perceptions, they said. The fog created optical illusions. The human mind filled in patterns where none existed. But Dalen knew what he had seen, and he refused to enter the fog again. On the 11th day, the fog finally dissipated. It happened suddenly, between 1 hour and the next. Rangers who had been monitoring the valley entrance reported that the fog simply dissolved, revealing normal autumn sunshine and clear air. Dalen immediately led a team back into the valley to search for Sarah and check on the two brothers who had refused to evacuate. They found the brothers' house empty. The two men were gone, with no sign of struggle or hasty departure. Their vehicles were still there, their belongings undisturbed. Like Sarah, they had simply vanished. The search expanded over the following days, involving dozens of volunteers combing through the valley and the surrounding forest. They found no trace of any of the 3 missing residents, but they did find something else. In several locations throughout the valley, they discovered areas where the vegetation had been affected in strange ways. Circular patches, roughly 20 feet in diameter, where plants had been flattened and showed signs of severe dehydration, as if all moisture had been instantly removed. The soil in these circles was dry and cracked despite recent rain, and in the center of each circle were marks in the ground, impressions that might have been footprints but were too large and too oddly shaped to be from any known animal. Analysis of the soil samples showed unusual mineral compositions and traces of compounds that should not have been present, but no definitive explanation could be determined. The official report classified the disappearances as missing persons cases, attributed the fog to unusual weather conditions, and left the situation unresolved. Dalen transferred to a different ranger district 6 months later. He could not continue working in an area where 3 people had vanished without explanation, where something had stood in the fog and watched him from between the trees. The experience had shaken his fundamental understanding of the world and left him with questions that would never be answered. The 2 brothers and Sarah remain missing. Their properties have been absorbed back into the forest, their families still waiting for answers that will never come. And sometimes, on foggy autumn mornings, residents of the surrounding area report feeling an unusual quality to the mist, a thickness that seems to muffle sound more than normal fog should. When that happens, people stay indoors and wait for the sun to burn it away, remembering what happened in Whispering Valley and praying it does not happen again. Dalen had purchased the remote cabin in the Appalachian Mountains as a retreat from his high-stress career in corporate finance. After 15 years of 80-hour work weeks and constant pressure, he needed somewhere to disconnect, to find peace in solitude and nature. The property was perfect: 12 acres of forested land, a well-maintained cabin with solar power and a wood stove, and most importantly, no neighbors within 3 miles. The closest feature of note was a grove of ancient eastern hemlocks about 200 yards behind the cabin, trees that had stood for centuries, their massive trunks and dense canopy creating a cathedral-like space beneath their branches. Dalen visited the property for the first time in April 2024, planning to spend a long weekend getting familiar with his new retreat. He arrived on a Friday evening, unpacked his supplies, and spent the first night enjoying the profound silence of the deep forest. The next morning, he decided to explore his property more thoroughly, following old deer trails through the woods and documenting interesting features with his phone camera. The hemlock grove drew him immediately. The trees were magnificent, some with trunks over 6 feet in diameter, their deeply furrowed bark showing the weight of centuries. The light filtering through their branches had a greenish quality. and the forest floor beneath them was covered with a soft carpet of fallen needles. Talon spent over an hour in the grove, photographing the trees and simply sitting in the peaceful atmosphere. It was during this first visit to the grove that Talon experienced the initial sensation of being watched. He was photographing one particularly massive hemlock when he felt the distinct impression that someone was observing him. The feeling was strong enough that he turned around, expecting to see another person, but the grove was empty. He called out, asking if anyone was there, but received no response. He attributed the feeling to the natural unease that comes from being alone in an unfamiliar place and continued his exploration. Over the following months, Talon visited the property frequently, usually spending weekends there. He found himself drawn repeatedly to the hemlock grove, finding something meditative about the space. But the sensation of being watched persisted and grew stronger. Every time he entered the grove, within minutes, he would feel eyes on him. The feeling was so consistent and so powerful that he began to wonder if wildlife was observing him from the dense branches above. Black bears sometimes climbed trees, and bobcats were known to rest on high branches. In July, Talon decided to investigate more systematically. He purchased 4 trail cameras, the kind used by hunters to monitor game, and positioned them around the hemlock grove. The cameras were motion activated and would photograph anything that moved within their field of view. He set them up on a Friday evening, positioned to cover the main paths into the grove and the areas where he most strongly felt the sensation of being watched. When he returned the following weekend to check the cameras, he found dozens of photographs. Most showed exactly what he expected: deer, squirrels, a fox, various birds. But scattered among these normal wildlife photos were images that made him deeply uncomfortable. In 7 separate photographs taken at different times between dusk and full darkness, there was a figure standing at the edge of the camera's field of view. The figure was humanoid in shape, but impossible to see clearly. It appeared as a darker shadow against the background darkness, with no discernible features or details. What disturbed Talon most was that in every single photograph, the figure was facing directly toward the camera, not standing in profile or looking away, but oriented exactly toward the lens, as if it knew the camera was there and was deliberately presenting itself to be photographed. Talon examined the photographs closely, zooming in on his computer to try to make out more details. But the closer he looked, the less clear the figure became. It had a quality similar to trying to focus on something in peripheral vision. The more directly he tried to observe it, the more it seemed to fade and blur. The figure's proportions also seemed wrong in ways he could not quite articulate. The arms might have been too long, or the head too small, or the torso too narrow. Every time he looked at the images, he noticed different inconsistencies. He checked the timestamps on the photographs. The figure appeared exclusively during the period from dusk until about midnight. The earliest appearance was at 7:43 p.m., the latest at 11:52 p.m. Never during daylight hours, and never in the deepest part of the night. Only during the transition periods when light was failing or preparing to return. Talon's rational mind offered explanations. The figure was probably just an unusual shadow cast by the trees, made to appear humanoid by the camera's night vision mode. Or perhaps it was a person, another property owner, or a hiker passing through, who happened to trigger the cameras. But neither explanation felt adequate. The consistency of the figure's appearance, the way it always faced the camera directly, the sense of intentionality in its positioning, all suggested something more deliberate. Despite his unease, Talon decided to spend more time at the property. Determined not to let unexplained photographs drive him away from the retreat he had invested in, he continued visiting regularly, though he found himself avoiding the hemlock grove during evening hours. He would hike there during full daylight, but as sunset approached, he made sure to be back at the cabin with the doors locked. In September, Talon brought a friend named Marcus to the property for a weekend visit. Marcus was a skeptic by nature, someone who dismissed supernatural explanations and approached mysteries with scientific curiosity. Talon showed him the photographs from the trail cameras, and Marcus agreed they were unusual, but suggested they conduct a more thorough investigation. They decided to spend an evening in the hemlock grove, equipped with powerful flashlights and a video camera to see if they could encounter or document whatever was appearing in the still photographs. They entered the grove just before sunset, as the light was beginning to fade. They set up 2 folding chairs near the center of the grove and settled in to wait. For the first hour, nothing happened. The forest around them grew progressively darker, and the sounds of daytime birds were replaced by the calls of owls and the rustle of nocturnal animals beginning their activities. Around 8:30 p.m., Marcus suddenly grabbed Talon's arm and pointed toward the tree line. There, barely visible in the gathering darkness, was a figure. It stood motionless about 50 feet away, partially obscured by the trunk of a large hemlock. Marcus grabbed his flashlight and shone it toward the figure. The beam of light illuminated the trees, the forest floor, the ferns and undergrowth, but where the figure had been standing, there was nothing. Just empty forest. They both stood, moving closer to where they had seen the figure. Marcus swept the area with his flashlight, while Talon recorded video. They found no evidence that anyone or anything had been there. No footprints in the soft needle-covered ground, no broken vegetation, nothing. They returned to their chairs and waited in tense silence. Over the next 2 hours, they saw the figure 3 more times. Each appearance followed the same pattern. A shadowy form would be visible at the edge of the clearing, standing motionless. When they shone light toward it, it would be gone, leaving no trace. But the most disturbing aspect was how the figure's position changed. It appeared in different locations around the grove, never in the same spot twice, but always maintaining approximately the same distance from where they sat. It was as if it was circling them, observing from different angles. The 4th time they saw it, Talon made a decision that he would later question. He stood up and walked toward the figure, moving quickly before it could disappear. Marcus called after him, telling him to stop, but Talon continued forward. He covered half the distance to where the figure stood before it vanished. But this time, as it disappeared, Talon heard something. A sound like wind through branches, except there was no wind, and within that sound, something that might have been words, a voice speaking in a register too low for human hearing but somehow still perceived. Talon stopped, suddenly afraid in a way he had not been before. The darkness around him felt different, heavier, as if the air itself had become thicker. He turned back toward Marcus and the chairs, and that was when he saw it clearly for the first time. The figure was standing directly between him and Marcus, close enough that he should have been able to make out details even in the darkness. But the figure remained frustratingly indistinct, a shape that his eyes could not quite focus on properly. Then Marcus turned on his flashlight again, and the figure was gone. Talon ran back to where Marcus stood, and without discussion, they both began packing up their equipment. They left the hemlock grove quickly, not quite running, but moving with urgent purpose. Only when they were back at the cabin with all the lights on did they feel safe enough to discuss what they had experienced. Marcus, despite his skepticism, admitted he had no explanation for what they had witnessed. The figure had not behaved like any animal he was familiar with, and it certainly had not been a person playing tricks. The way it appeared and disappeared, the way it seemed to be aware of their presence and deliberately positioning itself to be seen, suggested intelligence and intent. But intelligence of what? What kind of being watched from the shadows of an old hemlock grove? They reviewed the video footage Talon had recorded. The results were frustrating and disturbing in equal measure. The video showed the grove, showed Marcus with his flashlight, showed Talon walking forward. But it showed no figure. Where both of them had clearly seen something standing, the video showed only trees and darkness. Whatever they had witnessed did not register on the camera, or registered in a way that was not captured by the recording medium. Talon and Marcus left the property early the next morning, cutting their weekend short. In the weeks that followed, Talon wrestled with what to do. He had invested significantly in the property, and the cabin itself was exactly what he had wanted. But the hemlock grove, and whatever watched from within it, made the place feel unsafe. He consulted with several people, including a folklore professor who specialized in Appalachian traditions. The professor listened to his account with interest and suggested that the hemlock grove might be what old-timers called a liminal space, a place where the boundary between the normal world and something else was particularly thin. Certain locations, especially stands of ancient trees, were traditionally believed to be inhabited by entities that existed alongside humans but were rarely seen directly. The professor could offer no solution, only the observation that these entities were generally not actively harmful but were territorial. They watched, they made their presence known, and they expected respect and distance. The advice was simple: stay away from the grove, especially during the transition hours of dusk and dawn. Talon has followed that advice. He still visits the property, but he has stopped going to the hemlock grove entirely. He removed the trail cameras and avoids even looking in that direction when he is outside the cabin. He has accepted that 12 acres of his property are off limits, claimed by something that was there long before he arrived and will remain long after he is gone. The figure still appears in his dreams sometimes, standing at the edge of perception, watching with an attention that feels both curious and ancient. And sometimes, when he is at the cabin on quiet evenings, he hears that sound like wind through branches, carrying words in registers too low for human hearing. And he knows that he is being watched from the hemlock grove, observed by eyes that see far more than he will ever understand. Dion had taken up metal detecting as a hobby after retiring from his job as a high school history teacher. He found satisfaction in the methodical process of sweeping his detector across open fields and forgotten homesteads, listening for the beeps and chirps that indicated something metallic beneath the soil. Most of what he found was mundane: old coins, bottle caps, the occasional piece of farm equipment. But he enjoyed the treasure hunt aspect, and the historical significance of even small finds appealed to his lifelong interest in the past. In March 2024, Dion obtained permission to search an abandoned homestead in a remote area of West Virginia. The property had belonged to a family named Morrison, who had lived there from the 1880s until the 1960s, when the last surviving member had moved away. The house had long since collapsed, but the foundation stones remained, along with the overgrown remnants of outbuildings and gardens. It was exactly the kind of site Dion loved to explore. He spent the first day searching the areas around the house foundation, finding numerous small items: nails, buttons, fragments of pottery, a few wheat pennies from the 1940s. Nothing unusual or particularly valuable, but each item was a small connection to the people who had lived there. As the afternoon sun began to cast long shadows across the property, Dion decided to expand his search to the area beyond the immediate homestead. About 100 yards from the house foundation, in what had probably been a wooded section of the property, his metal detector gave a strong, consistent signal. The tone indicated something substantial buried at moderate depth. Dion marked the spot and began digging carefully with his folding shovel. At approximately 18 inches down, his shovel struck something solid. He switched to using his hands, carefully brushing away soil, and uncovered what appeared to be a metal box. The box was roughly the size of a toolbox, made of steel that had rusted heavily over the years. Dion carefully lifted it from the hole and set it on the ground. The lid was corroded shut, but with some effort, he managed to pry it open. Inside, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth, was a leather satchel. The satchel was in surprisingly good condition, protected by the metal box and the wrapping. Dion opened it and found himself looking at documents. There were several letters, yellowed with age but still legible. There were photographs showing people dressed in clothing from the early to mid-20th century. And there was a ledger, a small notebook filled with handwritten entries. Dion sat on the ground and began examining the contents more carefully, aware that he might have found something historically significant. The letters were dated between 1948 and 1951, and they appeared to be correspondence between two men. One was named Walter Morrison, presumably a member of the family who had owned this property. The other was named Henry Caldwell, who seemed to be some kind of business associate. But as Dion read through the letters, he realized they were discussing something criminal. They were writing in vague terms, clearly trying to avoid explicit statements, but the meaning was clear. They were involved in some kind of smuggling operation, moving goods across state lines and evading taxes. The ledger was more explicit. It contained detailed records of transactions, dates, amounts of money, and cryptic references to locations. Some entries were marked with stars or other symbols, and a few had been crossed out heavily. Dion flipped through the pages, fascinated by this window into illegal activities from 70 years ago. Then he reached an entry that made him stop cold. The entry was dated September 12, 1951. Unlike the other entries, which were terse and numerical, this one included a longer note. It read, "HC became a problem. Had to be dealt with permanently. Buried at the old well site. No one will find him there. May God forgive me." Dion stared at the words, his heart rate accelerating. This was not a record of smuggling. This was a confession to murder. Henry Caldwell, whose letters were in this very box, had apparently been killed by Walter Morrison. And according to this note, the body had been buried at something called the old well site. Dion knew he should contact the authorities immediately. This was evidence in what might be a decades-old unsolved murder case, but his curiosity as a historian and his years of research into local properties made him wonder if he could locate the old well site himself. If he could find additional evidence before involving the police, it would make the case stronger and might help bring closure to whatever family Henry Caldwell had left behind. He spent the rest of the day searching the property for any indication of an old well. He found two locations where depressions in the ground and stone arrangements suggested wells had once existed. Both had clearly been filled in decades ago, covered over, and reclaimed by forest. One was near the house foundation, the other was further into the woods, about 200 yards from where he had found the metal box. Dion returned the next day with more equipment, a soil probe, a more powerful metal detector, and a better shovel. He started with the well site further from the house, reasoning that someone trying to hide a body would choose the more remote location. He spent hours carefully probing the ground around the old well, looking for any indication that the fill dirt had been disturbed. Around mid-afternoon, he found something. The soil probe indicated a void space about 6 feet down, in an area adjacent to the well itself. This was unusual. Filled wells typically had consistent soil density throughout. A void space suggested that something had decomposed, leaving a cavity in the earth. Dion marked the spot and began to dig. The work was hard and slow. He had to excavate carefully, creating a proper excavation rather than just a hole, ensuring he would not damage any potential evidence. After several hours of work, as the sun was beginning to set, his shovel struck something that was not soil or stone. He knelt down and carefully brushed away the dirt, revealing fabric. Old fabric, rotted and stained, but clearly the remains of clothing. Dion stopped digging. This had gone from historical investigation to active crime scene. He carefully covered the excavation with a tarp, weighted it down with stones, and returned to his vehicle. He drove to the nearest town and went directly to the police station. The officer on duty listened to his story with growing interest and asked him to wait while he contacted a detective. Within 2 hours, Dion found himself leading a detective and 2 crime scene technicians back to the property. He showed them the metal box and its contents, which he had fortunately photographed before bringing it home. He then led them to the excavation site. The detective examined the exposed fabric and made a call. By the next morning, The site had been secured, and a full forensic excavation was underway. The remains were indeed human. Forensic analysis over the following weeks confirmed they belonged to a male individual, approximately 40 to 50 years old at time of death, who had been buried sometime in the mid-20th century. Dental records and DNA analysis eventually identified the remains as Henry Caldwell, a businessman from Charleston who had been reported missing in September 1951. His disappearance had been investigated at the time, but no leads had ever been developed, and the case had gone cold. The investigation into Henry Caldwell's murder reopened 73 years after his death. Walter Morrison, the man who had written the confession in the ledger, had died in 1963. But the case was not closed. Investigators wanted to understand the full scope of what had happened, to document the crime and provide answers to any surviving family members. Records showed that Henry Caldwell had left behind a wife and 2 young children. His wife had passed away in 1987, but both children were still alive, now in their late 70s. Detectives contacted them and informed them that their father's remains had been found and that he had been murdered. For these individuals, who had spent their entire lives wondering what had happened to their father, the news brought a painful closure. The investigation also uncovered more details about the criminal operation Walter Morrison and Henry Caldwell had been involved in. They had been smuggling cigarettes and alcohol across state lines, taking advantage of the different tax rates in various states to make substantial profits. The operation had been successful until Caldwell had apparently threatened to go to the authorities. Morrison's solution had been murder, followed by decades of silence. Dion found himself at the center of a media storm. The story of a retired teacher using a metal detector to solve a 70-year-old murder captured public attention. He gave several interviews, always emphasizing the importance of preserving historical evidence and treating such discoveries with proper respect. He donated the metal box and its contents to the state archives, where they would be preserved as part of the historical record. But the experience changed Dion's relationship with his hobby. He had started metal detecting as a simple pastime, a way to connect with history through found objects. Now he understood that the ground beneath our feet can hold dark secrets, that not all buried things are meant to be treasure. He continued detecting, but with a new awareness that any beep from his detector might lead to something far more significant than an old coin. Henry Caldwell was finally laid to rest in June 2024, buried next to his wife in a cemetery in Charleston. His children, both elderly now themselves, attended the funeral along with several grandchildren who had never known their grandfather. The case was officially closed, marked as solved after more than 7 decades. Dion attended the funeral as well. He felt a responsibility to be there, to pay respects to the man whose remains he had inadvertently discovered. After the service, Caldwell's daughter approached him and thanked him. She said that for 73 years, the family had lived with uncertainty, with the hope that their father might still be alive somewhere, combined with the fear that something terrible had happened to him. Now they knew the truth, and while it was painful, it was better than not knowing. As Dion drove away from the cemetery, he thought about all the other secrets still buried in the Appalachian Mountains. How many other crimes remained unsolved, their evidence hidden beneath decades of soil and vegetation? How many other families still waited for answers that might never come? The mountains kept their secrets well, yielding them only reluctantly to those persistent enough to search. And sometimes those secrets, when finally revealed, changed everything. Kendricks had been fascinated by acoustic phenomena since childhood. As a professional sound engineer who specialized in recording natural soundscapes for films and documentaries, he spent much of his time in remote wilderness areas, capturing the subtle sounds that most people never noticed. The whisper of wind through different types of vegetation, the calls of animals, the way sound reflected off rock faces and water surfaces. His recordings had been used in dozens of major productions, and he had developed a reputation for finding unique acoustic environments. In August 2024, while researching potential recording locations in the Appalachian Mountains, Kendricks came across a reference in an old folklore collection. The book mentioned a location in eastern Kentucky known locally as Echo Point, where sound supposedly bounced back in strange ways. The brief description was vague, mentioning only that the echo speaks with its own voice, and that locals avoided the area after dark. It was exactly the kind of unusual acoustic environment that interested Kendricks professionally. Finding the actual location took considerable effort. Echo Point did not appear on any modern maps, and most people he asked had never heard of it. Finally, an elderly man at a general store recognized the name and provided rough directions. The location was about 8 miles into the national forest, accessible only by hiking trail. The old man warned him that the place had a bad reputation and that people who went there sometimes came back changed. Kendricks thanked him for the directions and dismissed the warning as typical mountain superstition. He set out on a clear morning in mid-August, his backpack loaded with recording equipment. The hike took about 3 hours, following a maintained trail for the first 5 miles before branching onto an overgrown path that showed little evidence of recent use. The forest in this area was dense and mature, with massive oak and poplar trees creating a thick canopy that reduced the sunlight to a dim green glow. Echo Point, when he finally found it, was a natural amphitheater formed by rock formations. A semicircular cliff face rose about 80 feet high, creating a concave wall that faced a small clearing. The acoustics were immediately obvious. Even the sound of Kendricks's footsteps echoed back with unusual clarity. This was exactly what he had been hoping to find. He spent the first hour simply exploring the area and testing the acoustic properties. He clapped his hands and heard the echo return crisp and clear. He shouted and heard his voice bounce back. But there was something odd about the echoes that he could not quite identify. They sounded slightly different than normal echoes, as if the rock was adding some quality to the sound as it reflected. Kendricks set up his recording equipment and began conducting systematic tests. He recorded various sounds, speech, claps, whistles, and played them back to analyze the acoustic properties. As he reviewed the recordings through his headphones, he noticed something disturbing. The echoes were not exact replications of the original sounds. There were subtle differences, variations in pitch and timing that should not be present in a simple acoustic reflection. He decided to conduct a more controlled test. He set up his equipment to record continuously and positioned himself in the center of the clearing. He spoke clearly into his microphone. "My name is Kendricks. I am recording on August 15th, 2024. The echo came back almost immediately, but the words were slightly different. The echo said, 'Kendricks is here. Recording will begin soon.' Kendricks felt a chill run down his spine. He played back the recording to make sure he had not misheard. The playback confirmed what he had perceived. The echo had not simply reflected his words, it had responded with different words. That was impossible. Echoes were purely physical phenomena, sound waves bouncing off surfaces. They could not change the content of the sound. He tried again, speaking slowly and clearly. "This is a test. Can you hear me?" The echo returned. "I hear everything. Always listening." Kendrick stood in the clearing, his scientific understanding of acoustics crashing against the evidence of his own recordings. He considered explanations. Perhaps someone else was in the area speaking in response to his voice. But he had seen no one, and the timing of the responses was too quick, occurring immediately as a natural echo would. Perhaps there was some kind of audio equipment hidden in the rocks, playing pre-recorded responses. But that seemed absurdly elaborate for such a remote location. He decided to continue the experiment, documenting everything carefully. Over the next 2 hours, he conducted dozens of tests. He spoke questions and statements, and the echo consistently responded with different words. The responses were always relevant to what he had said, as if something was actually listening and formulating replies. But the responses were also cryptic and sometimes unsettling. When he asked, "What is this place?" the echo answered, "A boundary, a threshold, a listening post." When he asked, "Who are you?" the echo answered, "The voice of the stone, the memory of sound, the keeper of echoes." When he asked, "How long have you been here?" the echo answered, "Since the mountains rose, since sound first touched these walls, since silence learned to speak." The responses suggested intelligence, but Kendricks could not accept that. There had to be a rational explanation. Sound waves could not think or understand language. They were simply mechanical vibrations in air. Yet, his recordings clearly captured responses that demonstrated comprehension and intentionality. As the afternoon progressed, Kendricks noticed that the echoes were becoming more complex. Early responses had been simple sentences, but now they were offering longer statements without being prompted. He would pause in his questioning, and after a few seconds of silence, the echo would speak on its own, its words emerging from the rock wall as if the stone itself had learned to form language. "You seek to understand," the echo said unbidden. "You record and analyze, but some things cannot be captured in your devices. Some truths exist only in the moment of their speaking." Kendricks recorded everything, his hands shaking slightly as he adjusted levels and changed recording media. Whatever was happening here, it was the most significant acoustic phenomenon ever documented. If he could present this evidence to the scientific community, it would revolutionize understanding of how sound worked. But then the echo said something that made him reconsider. "Others have come before you. They all wanted to prove, to capture, to explain. None of them understood that not everything should be explained." Kendricks asked, "What happened to the others who came here?" The echo replied, "They listened too long, heard too much. Some truths should remain unspoken. Some sounds should never be recorded." For the first time since discovering Echo Point, Kendricks felt genuine fear. He thought about the old man's warning that people who visited this place sometimes came back changed. He looked at the hours of recordings he had accumulated and realized he had documented something that defied every principle of physics and acoustics he had ever learned. He was preparing to pack up his equipment when the echo spoke again, and this time its words were not a response to anything he had said. "You will take your recordings. You will try to share them. But your devices will fail you. The sounds you have captured cannot exist outside this place. We are bound to the stone, and the stone does not travel." Kendricks felt anger rise in him. He had spent his entire career capturing sounds, and he was not about to be told by an impossible echo that his recordings would not work. He carefully packed his equipment, ensuring all his recording media was secure. He had multiple backup recordings on different devices. Whatever this phenomenon was, he had documented it thoroughly. As he prepared to leave, he made one final recording. He stood in the center of the clearing and spoke into his microphone. "I have recorded everything that happened here. Whatever you are, your existence will be proven. Science will explain you." The echo's response was quiet, almost sad. "You still do not understand. I am not a thing to be proven or explained. I am what happens when sound becomes memory, when echoes learn from what they reflect. You cannot take that knowledge with you. It must be experienced here, in this moment, in this place." Kendricks turned and walked away from Echo Point, refusing to engage further with the impossible echo. He hiked back to his vehicle, his backpack heavy with recording equipment. He drove straight home, eager to review his recordings and begin the process of documenting this discovery. But when he arrived home and began downloading his recordings, he discovered what the echo had predicted. Every single recording file was corrupted. Not just the audio from Echo Point, but every recording from the entire day. Hours of carefully documented evidence, all reduced to meaningless static and digital noise. He tried multiple recovery programs, consulted with data recovery specialists, but nothing worked. The recordings were simply gone. Kendricks was devastated. He had documented something extraordinary, and now he had no proof it had ever happened. He considered returning to Echo Point with different equipment, with witnesses, with video cameras to document the phenomenon visually as well as acoustically. But something stopped him. The echo's words kept repeating in his mind. Some truths should remain unspoken. Over the following weeks, Kendricks found himself changing his mind about what had happened. He began to wonder if documenting and explaining the echo would somehow diminish it, would reduce something genuinely mysterious to a mere curiosity to be analyzed and cataloged. He thought about how much of the natural world had been stripped of wonder through explanation, how mystery had been replaced by measurement. He made a decision that surprised him. He would not return to Echo Point. He would not attempt to document the echo again. Instead, he would keep the experience as a personal memory, a reminder that the world still contained genuine mysteries that perhaps should remain mysterious. But Kendricks did write a detailed account of his experience, which he sealed in an envelope with instructions that it should not be opened until after his death. In that account, he included precise directions to Echo Point, along with a warning. He wrote that anyone who chose to visit the location should understand that some phenomena are meant to be experienced rather than explained, and that not everything that speaks to us needs to be captured and analyzed. He concluded his account with a question that the echo had asked him near the end of his visit, a question he had not included in his earlier description. What will you do with silence now that you know it can speak? Kendricks never answered that question directly, but his career changed after his visit to Echo Point. He continued to work as a sound engineer, but he became more selective about what he recorded. He began leaving some sounds uncaptured, some moments undocumented. He learned to appreciate the experience of sound in the moment, without the need to preserve it for later analysis. And sometimes, when he is alone in quiet places, he listens carefully, not with his equipment or his professional ear, but with something deeper. He listens for the possibility that the world might speak back, that silence might have something to say, that not every echo is merely a reflection of what we project into it. And in those moments, he thinks of Echo, Point, and the voice of the stone, and he wonders what other impossible conversations are waiting in the wild places of the world, heard only by those willing to listen without trying to capture.